why don't you start
Okay.
by introducing yourself and talking a little bit about where you grew up.
Okay. My name is Paula Bashford. I grew up mostly in Elkins. I was born in Elkins. We lived over in the Harmon area. That's where my grandparents were. And
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
and so we lived over there. I started first grade. Back then they didn't have kindergarten, and until about the middle of the 5th grade, and then we moved back to Elkins, and then I lived in Elkins until I was an adult. And then
What year were you born?
1958.
All right. Where did you move away to?
Well, I lived in a lot of different places. I got married young, and my first husband was a construction worker, and so he wasn't overly ambitious. So we moved a lot. We lived in Virginia, Maryland, Louisiana, Florida. So, and then I came back to Elkins in 1994, and I was here until 2002, the end of 2002.
All right. When did you start working for the railroad?
January 13th of 2003.
What did you start out doing?
Okay, I started out, they have a training course that is, it's 15 weeks long, and that when you're done with that, you can be a switchman, a brakeman, or conductor, or a locomotive hostler. So that's, when you're done with that class, that's what you do. And it's like, you go to class the first few days, and then they take you out in the yard, you know, and then you actually work jobs with people. And so you switch cars in the yard, you know, you build trains, you take out bad order cars that come in on a train and something's wrong with it. The carmen check them out and you take those out. And, so you do that, and then you go on road trips with conductors that are, you know, already working as conductors. And most of our trips were within, most of them were 130 miles-ish, rail miles, and you would you'd get on your train and go to whatever crew change point, and then you would stay there until you were federally rested, and then, or whenever they had the next train to go back to where you came from. So you just work out of a terminal, and then you go. I worked out of Lyons, Nebraska, and we went to Edgemont, South Dakota, Sterling, Colorado, Guernsey, Wyoming, or Ravenna, Nebraska, that was our long trip, and it was like 240 miles east. Mm-hmm. So, and then you would change, give your train to somebody else.
Okay. Can you explain briefly what federally rested means?
Okay, so they just changed that rule back about 6 or 8 years ago, but you have to have so many hours off. So you can't be called from the crew caller, and you can't perform anything, you can't work. So the mandated now is 10 hours off, and they can call you, in 10 hours to go to work in 11 and a half. It used to be they could call you in 8 hours. So that's what it was when I first went to work. They could call you in 8 hours to go back to work.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. So you did your training, and you can start out doing any one job. Which job did you take? Were you a switchman or a conductor or?
Originally, after my 15 weeks, because like my very first job as a student was switching in the yard. And the guys I worked with were great. They were really easy to get along with. They taught me lots of stuff, you know, and for me, it was really, I had never worked outside. I had never been around big equipment. So it was very intimidating for me at first. So, and I'm not mechanically inclined. So I was like, oh, I'm never gonna get this, but I loved it. After I got comfortable with it, but it was stressful at first, you know. And there was a girl in my conductor class from Texas, and she was the only one. There were 10 in our class, and there was just us 2 females. And she had driven a truck and worked on a farm, and so she was very outdoorsy more than I had always worked as a cashier or, whatever, front desk manager for a hotel. So I had never worked outside, and she was good with the outside stuff, and I was good with the studying thing, because you have to, pass tests every so often, and so we kind of helped each other out. But yeah, actually she was from New Mexico, but she lives in Texas now. But,
Okay. So what was your first job like when you were out of training?
They teach you in training how to look up the rules so you know what you need, to do if you have a problem. But you actually learn after you get out there on your own, and you have problems that you're like, oh my gosh, So, but I was a conductor. I was actually a switchman, and I was on the switchman's extra board, which that means they can call you for anything they want. And it's like a guaranteed board, so that if they don't call you and you don't work for a few days, at a time, then you get a guaranteed salary.
Okay.
But most of the time you work way over that, and you don't get the guarantee. But so I was a switchman in the midnight yard, and so you go to work at 11, you get off at 7 basically, and you build trains. They have storage tracks with all the different trains or train cars, and they give you a switch list, and they tell you what cars they need to have in this train. And so you spend your whole night building that train, or 2 or 3, how many ever trains you have to build that night. And the coolest thing was, which freaked me out the first time they did it, but it's called kicking cars.
Okay.
Do you know what that is?
No, can you explain it?
I can. You go, so you have all these cars, and you're building your train, and you need to get rid of cars in the middle or whatever, So you pull out a track, and it's got 25 cars in it. Well, you need the 13th car. So you need to get rid of the rest of those cars. So you pull it out, and then the engineer revs up the engine and shoves it back really fast, and you pull the pin to get the cars to separate, and they roll into the track. Somebody lines a switch, and they roll into that track, and then you pull back out, and then you kick out the car you want, and then you pull back out again, and you kick out. So the cars are going, zooming down the track all by themselves. Yeah, and what amazed me, when we were students, we were training in the yard, and someone kicked cars past us. And until they got right to us, we didn't realize they were rolling. That's how quiet they are.
Let me grab this real
Okay.
quick. Sorry about that.
So it would be very easy, if you were not always paying attention, to step back and the cars run over you. As a matter of fact, when I first went to work, there was a gentleman who had done just that. He was an engineer, and he was checking out, like, you need to write down your engines, your locomotive numbers, and he had gotten off the engine and gotten down on the ground and backed up to see his second or third, I don't know, whatever. Well, he backed up, and the switch crew was kicking cars, and the cars ran over him, and he lost both his legs.
Ooh.
Yeah, that was and I worked with guys who were on the switch crew who had kicked those cars, and there's nothing you can do. I mean, once they start going, they're done. You can't stop them, But yeah, that was a good lesson to learn.
Yeah.
So you always look both ways before you cross the track, twice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even if you know the track is dead. I mean, even if you know nobody's running on it. Yeah, and it always makes me nervous when you see these people who take their kids' pictures on the railroad. That always makes me nervous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So this first job, was it in Nebraska?
Yes,
Okay.
in Alliance, Nebraska.
Okay. Were there other people in your life who worked for the railroad?
Yes, actually, that's how I ended up in Nebraska. I was working here in Elkins, West Virginia, and I met a man who was coming through here on vacation, and I just met him for like 5 minutes. But then we called back and forth and wrote back and forth for a couple of years. And he was a conductor and had been for, at that time, like 20 some years. And he was from Ohio, but he lived out there in Nebraska. And so I decided to move to Nebraska, and I applied. They had openings everywhere, like all of a sudden. And so I applied in South Dakota and in Nebraska, and I got the job in Nebraska, and so I moved out there.
What did you think about doing this? Because that's a big change.
It was a huge change. And yeah, I was like, and I was older. I was, when we took our final conductor test on a Friday. That Saturday I turned 45. So not only had I not ever done anything like that, but I hadn't studied in years, you know, and so the tests and it was a lot. And it's like a whole other language. You know, they have words that mean something weird that nobody else ever would think of, you know. So yeah, it was a whole new world for me. So, yeah.
So, when did you start working in Elkins? When did you move back to Elkins?
I moved back to Elkins in April of 2018. I needed, I had worked for 15 and a half years in Nebraska. And we bought a house here like in 2013, I think it was. And then we would just come back on vacation. And before I left here, I had worked as a hostess on the New Tiger Flyer 1 day a week. And so I knew John, who owned the, you know, who ran the railroad. And when I'd come in on vacation, I would stop and talk to him. And so I went in the engine program to become an engineer like in 2005 with the plan to come back here and work my last couple of years that I needed to work. And so that's what I did.
Okay. What was that like?
Working here?
Working here?
It was a lot different. Because you have to figure that is a Class 1 railroad. They run, you know, the heaviest, longest coal trains in the country. And we did some freight too, but we were mostly a coal line. And so when I came back here, you know, the locomotives, instead of being made in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, were made in the 40s. And so it was a lot different as far as the equipment. And then having people on the train was a lot different, you know, because a coal car doesn't care if you hit the brakes too hard or you take off too fast or whatever. But, you know, with people, it was just like you were always conscious of the people back there that you needed not to knock around. So, yeah.
What was a normal day working and all of that like?
When you go and you do your air tests on your locomotives and you walk through them, make sure everything's on and what you need to check, and you know, then you do air tests, and then you have a certain time to be at the depot. That was another thing. You have a certain time to be there, you know, so they can load the train and load the food and do all that. The best part of it was meeting all the different people who rode the train. You know, you got all kinds of different people. I had one man one time, an older gentleman, and I guess somebody in the depot or somebody on the train crew when we were sitting at the depot told him that the engineer was a female. So he comes up to the window of the, you know, waves up at me, and he said, "Are you the engineer?" And I said, "Yes." And he's like, "Are you sure? Because I don't think they have female engineers." And I was like, "Actually, they do."
You would know.
Yeah. So he was really, it was funny. And when we were finished with the trip, you know, when we were unloading people from the train, he actually came up and said, "You did okay." So that was good. I was like, but yeah, I guess on the East Coast or this part of the country, there's not a lot. Out there, there are quite a few more. There was probably, I worked in a big terminal that had like 500 on train crews, which included conductors, switchmen, everything. And I would say probably 15 to 20% were female. But there were still people who had a problem with that, you know, some of the older guys and some of the younger guys too. But mostly they were all really good about it, I mean, you know. And I think that the main thing was, you know, you needed to come to work, do your job. You know, if you needed help and it was absolutely necessary, then ask for it. But otherwise, don't be helpless. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. We had girls that would come out of class and, you know, they were like, "Oh, I can't lift this, or I can't do this," you know? And that was the worst thing, because they made all the females look bad, you know? Or they dressed inappropriately. If you're working in a place where 85% of the people are men, then you should dress appropriately. You know what I'm saying? So that was the only thing I had a problem with some of the females. But yeah, I just went to work and did my job, and so I never, you know, I had people say, or I had other females say, "Don't you have a problem with guys making a pass, or, you know, whatever?" No, I never did. So everybody was always professional, and because you're in a little tiny space. For one time I was on a train for 18 hours because we were in a blizzard and they couldn't get us off the train. And when that happens, after 12 hours, you can't perform it, you can't do anything. You just have to sit there and wait for them to come with a van to pick you up. And, you know, I've known guys who were on trains for 26 hours, you know, but 18 was it for me. So you're stuck in that little tiny space, which is only, you know, like 8 feet wide or whatever, with somebody for all those hours. So you're gonna meet people that you aren't crazy about, but basically you meet a lot of different people, and you never know who you're going to work with. So you work with different people all the time, and it was interesting. Mm-hmm. So.
Okay. What are some of the most memorable events from your time working on the railroad? Was the blizzard one of them?
Yes. And there was another time where we had a big blizzard, and they parked trains. They did the handbrakes and parked the train out on the track, on the main track. We had multiple main tracks, so we had 2 tracks. You could go either direction. And so they, you know, had trains all over the place. Well, then they have to get crews to go out and get on those trains and start them up and, you know, get them going again. So it had been like 24 hours, and they had all these trains parked. And my conductor and I, his name was Kirk, and he was a really nice guy. But we had to take light power, which means we took engines out to drop off crews on the trains. And we were but to leave the yard, we had to clean out the switches. It took us like an hour and a half because when the snow gets in the switch, it can't switch so that the cars, or the train engine can go where you want it to. So yeah, it took us like, I don't know, an hour and a half to get out, even out of the yard. And then we took, we dropped off the train crew for coal train, and we dropped off the train crew for grain train. And then we were supposed to take like the maintenance of way people, who are the guys who take care of the track. And you have, for the switch points, like where a track, where you can go into a siding or you can go to the other track, they have switch heaters that are electric, and they have them on in the wintertime. But when it's that bad, it just can't keep up. And the temperatures out there in Nebraska get like way below zero. And so we were supposed to take them so they could clean out the switches, and then the switch heaters would do their job. But the train, like there was an empty coal train parked, and then there were, trains all along it. So the drifts, the wind would blow, and the drifts were huge. They were like way over top the engine. They were huge. And we had to go through them with just the engines. And the snow would come up and it would be like, cover the windshield. It was crazy. Yeah, it was crazy. So, but Kirk and I did it. We got everybody where they were supposed to go. But yeah, so that was crazy.
Wow.
Once when I was working the yard job, I went to work. I had actually gone on a trip, and so I flew back into South Dakota, and it was like 15 degrees. So I went to work that night on a switch crew, and it was minus 15 degrees. But the wind chill was minus 43. I had never, ever seen anything like that. That was crazy for me. And so the train master, who's the guy in charge, he comes out and says, make sure that all of your skin is covered up, go into the locomotive and warm up if you need to, and, just works slow and safely. So we actually built like 3 trains that night. And the guy that I worked with, his name was Daryl, and we both had on black coveralls. Well, when you would go out of the locomotive, your eyeballs would turn to gel. I mean, it was that cold. I've never seen anything like it. It was crazy. But Daryl was actually kicking cars, and he rode a cut of cars back into a track, and he wasn't out there 20 minutes, not even that long. And he came back and his coveralls were completely white, just from the frost. It was that cold. That's the coldest I've ever seen it. But yeah, that was different for me. I had been out there about a year, and I was like, oh, I don't know about all this. This is very cold. But yeah.
What town and city? Where was this located in Nebraska?
It's in the very northwest corner. So South Dakota is here, and Wyoming is here, and Colorado is here. So it's right in that corner.
Okay.
But yeah.
List of places to avoid in the winter.
Yeah. Yeah. We were about 52 miles from Scotts Bluff, which is the biggest town closest to that. But yeah.
Wow. What were some things that you were really proud of?
The fact that I worked and actually retired and did not get injured. That's a big deal. And that's what you strive for, not to get injured, because then, you didn't do your job. If you didn't work safely, and I know, and there are sometimes when you can't help it, like if you have a derailment or something like that wasn't your fault, something was wrong with the track or somebody else had a problem. But yeah, going home safely every day was a big deal. When I completed my engineer training. I was very proud of that. Because you weren't, if you worked as a conductor, and you went to engineer training, which was like 6 months, if you didn't make it through engineer training, you could not go back as a conductor. You were done.
Done completely with the railroad?
Yes. And a conductor's job is, they pay very well, you have good benefits, you know. So you've worked at this job for however long, and then all of a sudden, if you don't pass this final test, then you're done. So that was very stressful. And I was very happy when it was over. I was very happy when it was over.
Why would you not be able to continue working if you didn't pass it?
That was if you decided to take that advancement, then that was it. You were, you know. The older guys back, you know, 30 years ago, whatever, they could try to go in the engine program, but I guess they figured, you know, they didn't want to spend all that time and money training you, and then you not make it, and then, you know. But yeah, that was a big deal. In the final, they have the National Railroad Science Academy or something like that. It's called NARS, Academy of Railroad Sciences, I think that's what it is, in Kansas City. And that's where you go for your final. You go like the first couple of weeks of your engineer training, and then you go back and work with carded engineers, because that's a federal card you have to be an engineer. And then you go back for your last like 2 to 3 weeks and take all the final tests and all that. And if you don't pass it, and not everybody does, but they actually give you one chance. So if you don't pass it, then you can go back and work as a student for a minimum of 30 days, but up to like 60, I think. And then you can go back and try to take your tests again. So if you don't pass it that time, then you're done.
Okay, oof, that is a lot of pressure.
It was a lot of pressure, it was, yeah.
And you did it.
I did do it, yes, and I'm amazed that I did. Just because, you know, but it was fun, it was a good job. I enjoyed the people. I mean, you learned something just about every day. Something would come up that you would, you know, you learn something new. Mm-hmm. So.
When did you pass this test? When did you graduate?
It was in July of 2005. So I had been a conductor for about 2.5 years. And then like the 6 months. And then when I first got out of engineer class, they were really short on people. And so they recalled anybody who had trained there as an engineer. They called people back from Iowa and New Mexico and Arizona and made them come back, because they have like a recall where they can recall you if they trained you originally. And I got sent to Gillette, Wyoming.
Let's see. What were some major changes in the railroad that you saw over the course of your career?
Mostly, they came up with a few, you know, federal laws, the cell phone law, you know, any kind of electronics, like you couldn't. They came up with that. Usually, any time they change a law, it's because somebody had an accident, or somebody got hurt, or something like that. So there was an accident out in California or Texas, or I don't know, someplace, where the guy was texting and had an accident. So after that, you weren't allowed to have your phone on when you were in the locomotive unless you were sitting still, and all members of the crew agreed that everybody was not doing anything dangerous. Mm-hmm. You know, you weren't. So that changed. And then they came up with first they came up with, it was called Trip Optimizer, where it was kind of like cruise control on your car, you know, and it was to save fuel. So they wanted you to run with your Trip Optimizer running, you know, so that it would, but it didn't know what track you were on, you know, it didn't. So that was a little strange because you had to trust it, but then you had to take it off if you were going to change tracks or if you were coming up to a signal, something like that. Well, then they came up with Positive Train Control, PTC. And we were the first major railroad to get it. And I had been on vacation when they started it, and I came back and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I want to, this is scary. Because it was more, it could actually set the air, it could actually set the brakes for you. If it thought you weren't doing something right, it could set the brakes for you. And it knew what signals were coming up, basically. So it knew when you were supposed to slow down for a if you were coming up to an advance, to a stop or whatever. So it knew all that, but it had some bugs. And so you would, but it would give this big alert, you know, slow down, slow down, slow down. And you had so many seconds to do that, or it would put your train, it didn't put it in an emergency, it put it in a little bit slower than that, but it would break your train. It would put the brakes on and stop the train, which, you know, if you weren't in a position where you wanted to stop. But yeah, so that was a lot to get used to. But that's the biggest, I think those were the biggest changes, you know, where they were trying to make it more fuel efficient. That was the big thing. Everybody wanted to save fuel. So, you know, that was the thing that they wanted you to do, so.
Do you ever miss the railroad?
You know, I kind of do. Yeah. I retired at 62, which I could have gone to 67. But my husband is a lot older than me, and it was advantageous for him as far as his pension for me to go at 62. So that's what I did. Yeah, but.
What have you been doing since retiring from the railroad?
Well, we have a little bitty hobby farm. We have miniature donkeys and miniature goats. And then we have a couple calves now that we bottle fed. And we've done a lot of, we've improved a lot of things on the property that we have. And so I do that. I help my husband. I drive a backhoe, and which it's crazy because I was always like intimidated and would never like ride a riding lawnmower. And I still won't. Isn't that crazy? But yeah, but I do drive my husband's backhoe. It's kind of fun. I like that. He's got tractors, but they're kind of weird, so I don't ever drive them. But yeah, so we do things around the house. I, you know, for years have bought material to, you know, quilt and things like that. I have scrapbooking, like a ton of scrapbooking supplies, which, you know, I plan to scrapbook, but so far I've stayed pretty busy around helping my husband because it's just the two of us. So, yeah. But.
Are there any other stories from your time at the railroad that you want to record?
Well, let's see. I had a derailment once.
Oh yeah?
Yes, it wasn't my fault.
Start out with the important things.
Exactly. My conductor and I were coming into the yard on a freight train. And on the head end of the train, we had like 6 loaded vehicle cars. And they're huge. They're like 80 feet long. They're non-articulated. They don't turn easy. And so we were coming into the yard, and we got our destination from the yard master. She's the person who tells you, she or he, tells you where you're going to put your train, where you're going to park it for the next crew. And we were, like, we came in on one side of the yard, and she gave us a track all the way on the other side. But to get to that track, we had to go through like 3 really close crossovers. Well, 80-foot non-articulated cars don't really like to do that. But you can't say, are you sure you want us to go there? You know, that's not my job, it's her job, and so that's what we did. And we got the locomotives, and maybe one car, I think, through the crossovers, and then the rest of them just like hopped right off the track. So yeah, it was in the paper, it was embarrassing. They had pictures of the cars all willy-nilly everywhere. But yeah, that was kind of crazy. But and then one time I had it was Halloween, and it had started snowing, and the train in front of us, you have signals like approximately every 2 miles, but there are places where you have to hold back of that signal because there are crossings that you can't block. Well, the guys in front of us were going along, and there was a truck and a horse trailer going along the highway right beside of them. And then for some unknown reason, he just turned and went right across the crossing, and they hit him. And yeah, so because we had good signals, we were still going. Well, when we stopped, we had like 3 major crossings in this little town blocked. Well, you can do that for 20 minutes or so, but not after that. And so we had to back our train up like 8 miles. And this is like, we had like 145 loaded coal cars. So that train weighs 19,000 tons or something like that. And you can't back up unless you have somebody on the back of the train to tell you to back up. I mean, you know where you're going. So my conductor had to get a ride all the way to the back of the train, or if there wasn't anybody there to give him a ride, you have to walk. But yeah, so we had to back up like 8 miles. It was stressful, but you know, they stopped that train. I mean, either that train was stopped and they had to do the investigation and all that, so we just had to be relieved off of our train. We couldn't keep going so they brought somebody else to put on our train. But that was kind of, and the poor horses died. I felt bad for the horses.
Okay.
But
was the guy okay?
You know, he was.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think they hit like right at the front of the trailer, and one horse I think died instantly, but then the other one they had to put down, which I thought was sad. But people just don't, I don't think they just realize, you know, don't pull in front of a train, no matter what you do. Don't do that, you know, because they can't stop. And I don't know if he just didn't, I mean, he was going right along beside of them, so I don't understand why he didn't realize that he couldn't go, you know. But people do that kind of thing all the time. I was very lucky in that I never hit a person. We had guys who had people commit suicide by train, which is very stressful for the crew, you know. I mean, they would just like walk up the track in front of you. You come around a curve, you're going 45, 50 miles an hour, and there they are, you know. So it's very, I don't understand why people have to take other people's when they go, why they have to do that. But so that was stressful, and I was glad that I never hit anybody. I did on the passenger train have a lady run into me. Yeah, she was a little inebriated, I believe. And so we were coming down to the crossing, and I'm honking the horn. You know, it's a federal law. You have to honk the horn so many seconds. And so I was doing that. And yeah, she didn't stop at the stop sign or the railroad crossing sign. She just kept going. And she smacked right into the end of the locomotive, you know. I mean, it flipped her car around. She didn't get hurt really bad because we weren't going that fast. But it was stressful for me because at first I didn't know that she was okay, you know, because I'm at the front of the train. And yeah, so I think that people need, I've had people run across the track, and, I just think that people don't think of the consequences when they do things like that, or to teach your kid not to get too close to the track. I had one guy, this was crazy. The dispatcher called and said, a crew called in and said, we saw a man walking close to the track with a gun. And so they called, the dispatcher, and so the dispatcher called the police. Well, we were behind that train, and he was walking right beside the track. And we had slowed down because, they told us to expect it. But he didn't even, now this is a huge train, he didn't even look back. He was walking really fast with his little gun up on his shoulder. I don't know if it was a domestic thing and he was trying to find his wife, I don't know. But it was stressful for us because, I'm honking the horn and he's like right there and not even acknowledging that we were there. Didn't look behind him, nothing. So that was kind of weird, But luckily I never hit anybody, or I had a friend who actually, the train was parked and somebody tried to crawl through her train and she cut them in half.
Whoa.
But she didn't know because she was clear up the front of the train and they were halfway back, But yeah, I never, but people do crazy things.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, one of the questions that I've asked in previous interviews is, did you ever consider your work dangerous?
Yes. And anytime you were outside of the locomotive, like working as a conductor on the ground or a brakeman on the ground, that equipment is huge, and it weighs tons and it's non-forgiving, I was getting on a train one time and we put our own power on. We put our own locomotives, took it from the diesel pit and took it to our train. There was a misunderstanding somewhere. There was a switch crew working, and the yard master gave us permission to go down and get on our train, which we did. Then somebody forgot that the switch crew had been switching, and they didn't line that switch back. And she didn't tell us to do that, so we didn't do that. So they kicked cars, and my conductor had just hooked up the air hose, which you have to be between the engine and the cars to do that. And he had just done that and come out. And you have to tell the engineer that you're in the clear in case the engineer wants to move the train or whatever. So he gave me in the clear, and about that time, smack, all these cars came crashing into us. And just mere seconds, and his head would have been right there, Yeah, and so that was because somebody didn't do what they were supposed to do. And that's the big thing, human error. When I was a student, conductor, switchman, whatever, I was working the yard one night, and I was brand new. I'd probably been 2 weeks maybe, or something like that. And so when you're kicking cars, you walk up and you get a hold of the pin lifter, which the knuckles come apart. You pull the pin, the knuckles come apart. But you have to have pressure on them to get them to come apart. And so when you're kicking cars, you tell the guy, kick, and then you pull up on that pin lifter, and then you tell him to stop. And so when he makes that sudden stop, that jerk causes the cars to come apart if the pin lifter works correctly. So I was doing that. And the guy who was training me, whose job it was to keep me safe, he said, okay, go pull the pin. And so I walked up there, and naturally being right-handed, got a hold of the pin lifter with my right hand. The problem with that was it didn't lift. So I was walking backwards, which is a big no-no. I tripped over a switch stand, which he should have stopped me prior to that. When I tripped, I fell, my head was against the rail, and the cars went over top of my head. That was the biggest lesson I learned. Don't ever walk backwards, pay attention to your surroundings. But also, if you're training somebody, it's your responsibility to teach them those things, not to just let them fail miserably. But yeah, so that was very scary for me. But when I was training, they were short on people a lot, and so they had people from different terminals. Like if the terminal you worked out of was so slow that they had furloughed people, then you could go someplace else and work if you had the seniority to do so. And so we had guys working in our yard that, didn't ever work there. So it was like they were not good trainers for somebody who was just learning. But I had a couple of engineers, Joe Pokorski and Jim Arntz, and they taught me more than the guys I was training with. And they would say, don't do this, don't do that, you know what I'm saying? And then Joe told me, like, you don't realize it, but like if trains are moving in opposite directions, it gives you you can actually walk right into a train if you're in the middle of those two trains and they're going, I don't know what that feeling is called, but you can just walk right into that train. And so Joe Pokorski told me, if you're ever in a situation where you're between two moving trains, just sit down on the ground and put your head down. So, because it gives you that, I don't know what it's called. It's not,
Is it like the low center of gravity prevents you from being pulled any which
exactly,
direction?
right. And yeah, because there are times when you do that, when you're switching in the yard and trains coming in and trains going out, and yeah. So it's a weird feeling though, and it's almost like vertigo, but not quite, So, but yes, but I always say that Joe and Jim were good. So.
Wow.
But, yeah, I can't think of much of any other thing that I did. Yeah, so. But it was a lot. It's a lot. And, and you depend on the people around you to do what they're supposed to do. And you try to do what you're supposed to do so that you don't put somebody else in danger. So, I don't know. That's all I know.
That's all you know?
Yeah. But it was fun. I enjoyed it. And like I said, my husband did it for 35 years almost. He was a conductor, and he enjoyed it.
Did he ever take the engineer's test, or did he?
No, he didn't. He hired on like back in 1980. And when they got rid of brakemen, there was a deal where the conductors, because it started out like as a 5-man crew, and it eventually got down to a 2-man crew. So it had to do with your union. Those guys were your union people, whatever. The brakeman and there was a head brakeman and a rear brakeman, and back when they had cabooses. Mm-hmm. And so when they got rid of that job, the deal the union made with the conductors was, okay, you'll get, it was called a productivity fund. And like when they first started it, it was just pennies. I mean, it wasn't very much at all. But by the time, like every trip that you made, you got a certain percentage. And so by the time he was done, I mean, those checks were huge. Every December the 15th, they would get this big bonus check. And engineers didn't get that. So if you gave up your conductor's job and became an engineer, you didn't get that anymore. So yeah, so he went to Nebraska from Ohio specifically because he wanted to be a conductor. Because he lived in a railroad town, Norfolk Southern, back then it was Norfolk Western, I think, but went through his hometown. And he remembers even back to the steam engines. And he's older. And he would go down and, get the guys lunch and stuff like that when he was just a little kid. And he always wanted to be a conductor, and he couldn't get hired in his hometown. So when he heard that there was a big coal boom out west, he decided to go.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, I can't think of any more questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry if I was not very good.
No,